Hey you guys, this is Josh
and Carolyn
with Homesteading Family, and welcome to this week's episode of the Pantry Chat, Food for Thought.
This week we're answering your questions, and there's a lot of them this week, so I think we're gonna just dive right in.
Right, it's a Q&A kind of day. So yeah, we're gonna get right in here and we'll just sprinkle the chit chat throughout the Q&A. Yep.
All right.
Okay. Let's see here. That one I think we've answered not too long ago. Let's see.
That's a good one.
Megan Boxwell Ippoliti, I hope I said that right, Megan, on gut healing bone broth. How long does the broth keep in the refrigerator, and can I freeze it into smaller portions and thaw it when needed?
Okay, so I have a trick or two here. First of all, yes, you can absolutely freeze it and thaw it as needed. You can can it so it sits on the shelf, although it does lose some of the collagen, kind of gets overheated in it, so it doesn't develop real well, some of the gelatin. So in the canning process, you can freeze dry it. You can even dehydrate it and make your own homemade bouillon out of it, which is pretty cool. So you can do a lot of things to store it longer term. As far as the refrigerator goes, you know, it's like any other fresh food. So you're really maxing out at about 7 days in the refrigerator. However, I learned a trick from a friend quite a few years ago, which will extend it very nicely, usually to about 2 weeks. And that is that if you take your hot bone broth and you ladle it into jars and cap it down while it's still really hot, it will seal. Now, this is not the kind of seal, it's not been processed, so it's not shelf stable by any means at all. So don't go stick this on your pantry shelf. But when you put it into the refrigerator, because it's sealed down, it will actually give it a little bit of extra time in the refrigerator. So usually you can get that to about 2 weeks. So anyways, that's outside of normal food recommendations. So try that at your own risk. But we've had great success with it in our house. Cool. So yeah, there you go.
All righty. Let's see here. Several people, and can we harvest the garden in time? This is a varietal question. What variety of crab apples do you have?
I wish we
knew, because they are awesome, but they were here when we've gotten here, and honestly we haven't done like a deep dive to try to figure it out. They're larger, kind of oval shaped, about thumb sized, get very, very vibrant red, and they're actually good to eat when they're just right. I mean, they're tart, but they've got good
like
flesh.
A sour apple candy, because they're sour like puckery, but they're sweet and really good flavor. But they're white fleshed. They're not pink fleshed. So I know some people have crab apples that are actually pink fleshed, and these are not. These are a white flesh variety. But because of the vibrancy of the skin, it still turns everything that they're in an amazing pink color.
We'll try to figure that out one of these days, because we actually want to propagate them and maybe spread them around the property a little bit. They have performed pretty well every year we've been here throughout the different weather, and even we've had at least one year that was not a good apple year,
and they still
did well. So really, really like that.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Oh, I like this one. Jules Hardy on Can We Harvest the Garden in Time? Any good apps to use for frost weather warnings? And I can tell you what we use right now, but this is one of those things where I say you got to experiment with your area, because we found over the last 20 years and living in different places that different apps as far as weather forecasting have worked better in one area than another.
Right.
And so we use Weather Underground. And for us in our location, that has seemed the most reliable, and it definitely lets us know more about freezes. I think it gives frost warnings too. So it comes right up on the app when we're looking at our weather, and it seems to work pretty well for us because it's a lot of local stations, individual stations that people place, and it's collecting data on a more micro level, and then putting it in, feeding it into the larger level. So that seemed to work pretty good for us, but that's not always been the case.
Sorry, when we've moved to new areas, we've often pulled up a whole slew of weather apps and then kind of tracked them for a couple months and seen what is the most correct. And it's amazing. In one area, one app will be most correct in a different area, like Josh is saying.
Yep.
A different app will be most correct. So is that even a term, most correct? I guess so. It will be most correct.
You're the teacher.
That sounds a little odd while I'm saying it. So anyways, that's probably the best way to go, is to just try them out and see what works well for your area. Ask your neighbors too. See if they have something that they use, and ask them, do you find that it's correct a lot of the time? Because a lot of people just use whatever the first thing is that they find, and they don't really think about
Right.
how off it is.
Yep.
So
yeah,
anyways.
take a season and compare a couple, whatever advice you get.
Yeah, if you have a weather app that you love, put it in the comments below so people can check that out and try some different
Good
ones.
idea.
Yeah.
Like that. Yep. Let's see here. Fiaker Farms. Hey, we know them. On compost. So you'll run it over winter, aerobic, or thermal. So she's talking about the compost pile. I assume I'm not sure which post that is. That probably has to do with building the latest one this year.
Okay.
And we try to always keep it aerobic. And that is oxygen rich, not anaerobic, which would be oxygen depleted. And so compost you really want to keep in an aerobic form if you can. And so yes, we'll keep it going, meaning I'll turn it and add to it as long as I can. But once the snow starts to settle, we just let it sit, and it will slow down. But I've seen it stay active into January.
Yeah.
And melt the snow to where it doesn't get any snow on it until it's cold for a long time. But let it go dormant through the winter, and then once the thaw comes, I start turning it again and it reactivates.
Good.
Yep. And that works great for us on our scale.
Okay. Good.
Let's see. Beth May on easy white bean chicken chili. Ooh. She says, I grew red kidney beans for the first time this year, an heirloom variety from Azure. And I am wondering if there is a way to can them for quick use in things like chili. They have dried down and are off my plants now. What should I do?
Great. Yes, you can. You can just can them like you can beans. Any other beans, just know that amongst beans, each type, a different amount of dry beans. One amount of dry beans will create a different amount of cooked beans. So you just have to play with that amount a little bit and make sure you dial that in and know how many beans you need in order to fill your jars. But if they're already dried down, you're going to treat them like any other dry bean. If you were to harvest them while they were still green and fresh and shell them that way, there's a different processing time. I mean, not green. I know. Green is in immature, right? Not dry, not the color. Then there would be a different processing time. But since they're already dried down, you just follow bean directions, dry bean directions. We have a video out on how to can black beans. So it would be the same thing, just again, the amount of dry bean to the amount of cooked bean you're going to end up might be a different ratio.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Good.
All right. Belinda G via email question. She says, we're going to be butchering our own chickens in a few weeks, but we have too many to do ourselves. If we have neighbors to help, do you pay them or offer to give them meat in exchange for their help? That's a great question.
That is a really good question.
Yeah.
And I think this is a great place to get into that bartering system a little bit more and offer the meat first. Yeah. A lot of people are really excited about that. They'd be really, really thankful to get their hands on some good fresh meat.
And to learn the process, to be, even if it's not something they want to do all the time, we found people just to get engaged with their food and be connected to their food. So, if you can bring them in and have a great day, if we do that, we usually provide food, provide a meal. Yeah. Or two, and beverages, and then, some birds.
Yeah. Some finished meat birds.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a good way to go.
Okay, a little sticky there.
Okay, some of these are really, really good.
Okay, do you want to do this one here?
Sure.
From Eva? Okay. Eva Wan, also writing in via email. I am always trying to expand my pantry, but a challenge I'm facing there is fresh produce. How can I only go shopping every 2 weeks and still get fresh food on the table?
That's right. Yeah, so Eva is actually referencing a video that I did about I think it's the 10
Step
steps
5.
to a well-stocked pantry.
Yep.
And getting that fresh produce in there is really important. That's where your garden comes in. Most of the year, that's pretty easy, right? I mean, gardening. If you know how to garden, you have a garden set up, that's not hard. Where it gets really challenging is the middle of winter, depending on where you live, and having that fresh produce. So for us, sometimes that means growing sprouts, sometimes that means the root cellared veggies, and sometimes it means we eat fresh produce like fresh greens, like salads, when we go to the grocery store, which can be quite rare. Sometimes if I'm in town, I'll just run in and get some salad in the middle of winter just because I'm really wanting some raw, Eventually, hopefully, we'll be able to work out our system so that we can grow right through the winter and at least grow some greens. But at this point, we're not there yet, aside from the sprouts. So anyways, it is a kind of finagle the situation. It really depends on your particular situation. If you live in, a lot of areas, it's been down. What's the coldest we've seen so far?
Well, we've seen 22, and we've been solidly in solid freezes being 27 or below a lot of the last several weeks. And we had fresh kale for dinner.
We had fresh kale last night. And so, the leeks are still standing out in the garden. The kale's still standing out in the garden. The broccoli, actually the sprouting broccoli, is still out there standing very beautifully. So you can actually get a long ways into winter. Our problem comes when the snow buries everything. So if you had the right infrastructure, you can see you'd be able to really extend that season. So that's kind of the eventual goal. But while you're getting there, sometimes, as long as we remember that the fresh green salad and the raw salad is actually, it's kind of a luxury, actually, is what it is. As much as we feel like we need it all the time for eating healthy, that is not traditionally the norm when you live in an area that you can't grow it year-round. So we just have to kind of accept that fact and put it in our grocery cart, just like we put in the chocolate and the coffee and the other things that are kind of luxury items, but we still go to the grocery store for. So I think that's the way to approach it. The rest of the year when it's fresh, eat it as much as you can, really stock up on it.
What is the Victorian garden show that we watch?
The Victorian Kitchen Garden.
The Victoria Kitchen Garden. That's a BBC production.
It's an old BBC
older.
production.
If you can find that, that has some really valuable strategies for extending season, growing things in dark rooms. If I don't think that's the right term, but there's some really neat strategies there. And it takes infrastructure, and it's energy intensive one way or another to force these things to grow throughout the season if we want fresh. But there are things that can be done. We have plans to build in little systems as we can, and that is a great, it's just a fun show to watch. It takes you through a whole year of Victorian garden, and they do a lot of pushing the season, and there's a lot of older strategies there that are really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
let's see here. I think I'm going to throw this one out here.
Okay.
That's good. Sally Farb on how she makes all her dairy in 2 hours. How many of these products are classified as raw? I buy my milk from a certified raw dairy, so I would love to make raw cheese and sour cream and yogurt myself. Just want to keep all that raw goodness, but pasteurizing changes everything.
Yes. So this is one of those topics that kind of has a lot of buts to it, I want to say, or it depends. Certainly in that video, things like the cheddar, I think I made cheddar in that video, and I believe some of the fresh cheeses that I made, I'd have to go back and look at the actual recipes that I did in that particular video. As long as they're not heated to over about 120 degrees, they would be considered raw still. The yogurts and all of the cultured dairies that we make in that video have been pasteurized first. What's really important to understand is that the culturing process brings back in those things that were killed in the pasteurization. So this is really, really important because now we've kind of swung the other way in some of the healthy homestead circles, whereas everything used to be pasteurized, that used to be what you were supposed to drink, right? Okay. And now we're kind of going all raw. It's all got to be raw. It's all got to be raw. And I think balance is the key to this, because bringing those cultured culturing that milk brings back in the enzymes. It brings back in the probiotics. It starts bringing back in all of those things that were lost in the culturing or in the pasteurization process. So can you make raw yogurt or sour cream or buttermilk? Absolutely. You can make all of those things raw, but what you have to realize is that very quickly within a generation or two of doing that in your kitchen, you no longer have what is technically yogurt. You have a clabber is what you have. You have your localized bacteria has then taken back over that product. So you're not going to be able to stabilize it as a product that you expect. It's going to be a lot less like store-bought and a lot more like whatever the bacteria dictates that's in your milk in your kitchen.
Which might be great. You might love it. It's
not a bad thing.
You might not like the taste of it because you're going to lose that control. Whereas with the things that you're pasteurizing, you're then kind of farming more specific bacteria.
Exactly.
That produces an outcome that's repeatable and that generally you want or you like.
Which is really important when you start taking that cultured product and using it as a starter for a next cultured product like a cheese. So in that video, I'm taking the yogurt or the buttermilk, and probably the buttermilk, and I'm actually using it as a starter for the cheddar cheese. Well, as that cheddar cheese sits and ages for 60 days, 3 months, 6 months, however long you're going to take it, that bacteria is doing things. And depending on your bacterial profile, you're going to end up with different flavors in your cheese. Not all of them are going to be awesome.
Well, and
some of them are going to be incredible.
And they can get compounded
yes.
in that process. So good things can get compounded, but because you're not controlling it as much and you're relying on the environment, some of the things that aren't so great can also get compounded.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's not to say you're going to have cheese that's bad. It just might not taste good.
Yeah.
So it'll still be safe. So you just have to understand what the long-term effect of what you're doing is. You're not going to have yogurt. You're going to have clabber. You're not going to have buttermilk. You're going to have clabber. And all of that is fine if that's what you want and you're okay with that. I just put some wariness out there about then using that to culture your hard-aged cheeses.
Oh,
so
cool.
Yeah.
Okay, Brianna Lawrence on Pantry Chat. How do you triage your projects? This is great, and we're going to dive right into planning, which we just talked about last week. But we are on year 2 and often find we get things started enough to function, but not actually done, and then end up leaving it to put out fires somewhere else. Brianna, we can definitely relate as part of the homesteading life. And it can be really challenging because fires and projects, real fires obviously happen in places too, but a lot of stuff comes up. And this is where planning, in the episode that we talked about last week, one, prevention. So preventing, having to triage projects by good planning and good actions is the start. That doesn't eliminate everything. But that's the start that a lot of us are not very good at. And we just dive in head on and we're doing it all and we're actually opening up the door for chaos and things to go wrong.
So she's asking about how to triage it. I think that, you say that the best cure is prevention.
Right.
Prevention is the best medicine, right?
Absolutely.
So don't get there in the first place is the best answer to that, but we all get there at some times.
Right. So first we want to try to prevent them. And by preventing them, that alone gives you the space that when you do have something happening, one, you've got a little more mental capacity, time capacity to deal with it.
Right.
And, I think the other part of that is keeping a cool head. Mm-hmm. And just like you've planned beforehand, come up with a plan with whatever's going on, rally together, get whoever's involved or whoever you need involved together, come up with a plan and figure out how to deal with it. Because stuff happens. It definitely happens. Does. Definitely gets challenging.
So my top method is just don't sleep.
Exactly.
It doesn't work long term, let me tell you. It doesn't really even work short term.
But, sometimes it happens. Sometimes we lose sleep over these things. And so, it's just try to live a balanced life, try to plan things out, try to avoid it. And that leaves you some margin. Tristan and I were just talking about this. He's 16, he's working, he's doing a lot. And we're ones that naturally tend to not leave a lot of margin sometimes. We're learning. And so, we call it margin. That's leaving space, that's leaving cushion, because disasters happen, projects fall apart, somebody gets sick, somebody breaks a leg. I mean, there's a million things that happen that we have to triage. And so the more margin we can live in our life, like we were talking about last week, instead of 5 projects and trying to get them all done, plan out 3 or something that seemed doable, and create space, and that releases the intensity at least.
Well, I think really important too, moving forward, is realizing that you're probably like us and have a tendency to over plan projects. And so when you go into planning, you need to write that in big bold letters at the top, simplify, less projects, just remind yourself that you have that tendency, and then fight it. Go against it, and make sure you build in the space to be successful at the things that you are doing, so that you don't end up with these kind of half-done projects that are falling apart on you.
And, let me, I think, address a real underlying factor, and that's the intensity that a lot of us feel right now to get things done, to grow our gardens, to improve our storage, to build resiliency in the many different areas, power backup, whatever it is. I think a lot of us are living with a greater urgency than we were a couple years ago, and I think as long as we're being level-headed, that's valid. But we've got to be careful about that urgency just driving us to hammer away. There's only so much we can do. And so again, taking the best steps we can, because we can create our own problems by being so ramming straight ahead and so motivated, and maybe sometimes scared, or whatever the motivating factor is. And again, we want to be level-headed even in the big picture. And that helps you move through these things, because there's just some stuff you got to triage. It's a problem, you got to deal with it, you can't avoid it. And you need the mental space and emotional space.
But a few projects done really well are going to move you ahead better than a whole bunch of projects that are half falling apart that you have to go backwards fix later. So, just keep remembering that. Work on the big infrastructure things that are really going to move you ahead as a priority. And if that's all you can do, that's all you can do. And if that's all you can do, and do it successfully and well, so that it's actually taking you a whole step ahead for the next year, then that's all you can do.
That's well said. Essentially, doing less in a more controlled manner is more, because in the end, you've got a couple things fall apart here and there, you can deal with it. But if you're doing too much and things start falling apart, and it becomes a mess. And we've seen people crash their whole life doing this, because they go in too full on, too much, too ambitious, and they put all their time, all their money, and try to do it all at once. And that's deadly, honestly, to a homestead.
It is.
And to a family. It can be very, very deadly. And so
it can wreck marriages really quickly too.
Absolutely.
We've seen that, unfortunately.
Okay, let's see.
Let's see. Here's one we can do.
Moonshine Girl, all right. Hey there. On 5 fast breads I make from my 5-minute bread dough. She says you let it rise before putting it in the fridge, but do you have to let it come to room temperature before you use it?
Good question. Usually in the rising process, it will come up to room temperature. So no, usually I take the shortest method possible and just scoop it out cold and start working with it cold, because even the working with it will start warming it up a little bit. It may take a little longer to rise enough if it is really cold, but it'll warm up in a few minutes. It doesn't take very long. So
cool.
Cool.
All right. I like the thinking here, and we've not tackled this, but I'm going to bring this one out because it's an interesting strategy. The stews on how much food do you need for a year? And they say, I'm wondering, I have an extremely small holding, half an acre, to farm. What is the possibility of growing huge bumper crops to last 2 years at a time? So I think what you're getting at is, instead of growing yearly, maybe you're committing some space to growing larger crops and then not growing them the next year so you can grow another crop.
I see.
That's what I'm interpreting there, to last 2 years.
Huge bumper crops to last 2 years at a time. And just to clarify, I think there's only a quarter of an acre to farm.
Quarter of an acre to farm,
okay.
Yeah. So I think that's a neat strategy. We haven't really employed that, but if I understand what you're saying, right, like, okay, one year maybe we're going to grow a whole lot of beans.
Okay.
With the idea that we're going to get a lot of beans put up that year and have 2 years of storage for them. So maybe next year we do something else. I could certainly see an efficiency to that, so that your preservation year, you really tackle this one thing, and there is efficiency in, volume in a project, and doing something like, okay, we're going to grow all this, so it's the same growing pattern, it's the same preservation pattern, and you could do that with a lot of different crops for things that are going to store that way. So I think it's an interesting idea, and I think it's valid. I've thought about that. We've never quite done it that way, but what do you think?
Well, I've thought about it in terms of seed saving because there's only so many of some sorts of things. So that's more within that you can grow within an area. Let me finish that sentence. If you're going to save the seeds and have them true to type. So I've thought about that more for varieties, like one year we grow one type of pumpkin, the next year we grow a different type of pumpkin.
So that you can maintain your seed
without
for those,
a lot of tricky seed saving things.
Right.
But you do have some drawbacks, and that's in the preservation, right? Things, imagine green beans that have been in the freezer for 2 years. It's just not going to be great. So maybe you've got that worked out because you have a freeze dryer. You feel like that's going to be good enough for 2 years. But things do decline on the shelf. The other thing is your seed saving, is that, some seeds don't last well multiple years. A lot of them will get you quite a few years. A lot of them will get you even 5+ years, but you'd want to make sure you really knew about that. So I guess I have my hesitancies, but I guess that's probably more because I haven't seen a successful model doing that yet.
Well, and the other risk is just the lack of diversity in the garden, and you can't predict the weather, and so things happen, and so the more you go towards less crops,
too many eggs in one basket.
Right. And so, if you've ever looked at investing, diversity is key, right? Well, really on the homestead, in some of the older homesteads, they stayed diverse. They didn't do this monoculture that we tend to do today in farming. They had a lot of diversity, and that hedges the different problems that can come up if you get a really dry summer, or really wet, or certain pest hits you, or whatever. If it goes great, good, it really works. But the opposite's true. If it goes bad, and that crop doesn't do well, then you have a 2-year failure. And so you've got to think about the risk with that. And I'd say even more so maybe on a small holding, because you're limited in space. And so if you put a lot of space to one thing, you are taking a risk there. So you just got to be aware of that.
Now, I will say though, don't feel like having a small piece of land that you can garden and farm in. A 1/4 acre is actually quite a bit of land.
Oh, you can do so much on that.
You can grow a huge amount of food on that. So I don't know how large your family size is, how many people you're feeding off of that. But, especially if it's just a couple of people, I don't see why in a 1/4 acre, depending on your soil and, the aspect and are you getting sun and some of those things. If you have good growing space, you can do a phenomenal amount of food in a tiny space if you set it up right.
We're learning, as we've learned a lot more about soil, and I mean as a human culture, we've really learned a lot about soil, I think, in the last decade or so, and particularly within the gardening models, we're learning that actually more is more, that more diversity, sometimes dense planting, you got to get your soil up to that level, but it also helps bring your soil up. You can actually produce more if you're managing right in a small space. And we've sure done that. Our main crop, and we're definitely on more than a 1/4 acre of farming the gardens, but our main crop is 1/4 acre. And we do a tremendous amount with that.
We're also feeding 12 people.
Yeah.
So
we've probably got closer to getting closer to a 1/2 acre in production. Not quite, but still, that's a relatively small amount of space to feed so many people and growing most of our vegetables that 3/4 at least for the year. So you can do a lot in that space.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Let's see. I think we can maybe get to one more here.
That sounds great.
Did you want to talk about this? I think this has come up a couple times, this question here.
Sure.
And so, Wanda Hebert on a Facebook post says, I have a question about cast iron. Someone gifted me a very nice, extremely heavy cast fry pan, but it's made in China. And this ties into another question in here somewhere when we were looking at them about, should we be concerned about the metal, the cast iron that's made in China and the quality of it? And I think that's a very valid question.
And I do not have a good answer for you on that as far as conclusively, should you be concerned or not? I think there is a lot of I don't want to say speculation. What's the word? Sorry, guys, I just lost my word. We tend to lump it all together and say, hey, because it's from China, it's probably has something bad in it, right? Or it's unregulated. It's not being watched. There is a lot of truth in that, without the regulation there, we don't really know what we're getting. And there's a lot of shortcuts that can be made in the production cycle that are harmful to us and have bad things in it. So that is very, very true. But it doesn't mean that everything that's coming from China is necessarily bad or harmful. So I would be wary to say, yeah, just throw it out. On the other hand, the problem here is that you don't know. So now the reality is there is a lot of lack of transparency, even in the United States brands, for something like cookware. We don't actually know. It's not like they have an ingredient list sitting on there that we can, check and make sure, the government said that this is what's really in here. It's been checked. So I guess I tend to be maybe a little wishier-washier. I don't know. If anybody has any actual evidence on what might be in there, what might be dangerous, or what should be done with cast iron, I would love to hear about it.
Well, and I'm going to give a little different perspective because I would tend to err towards, I would be suspect of that. From my side of being connected to different people in manufacturing and some metalworking, I definitely know that a lot of the Chinese metal is inferior. No doubt about it. Just different projects that I've been involved with, there is a quality issue. Often is. Speaking about cast iron itself in a food product, you can't say that that's the case for sure. But it is something to be aware of, and we're pretty concerned and think about what we cook in and what we do. So if that's a concern to you, it's definitely something to look at and consider, and it just needs homework. Because we can't say, yes, that's got a problem. I've never heard anything about cast iron, but I definitely know there are different grades of metal, and that a lot of the Chinese grades of metal, not all, there are people that get things done in China and produce a good quality product, but a lot of them, and I've had this with conversation with fabricators in different areas, and when it comes down to price, it's like, well, we can do it with this metal, it's from China, and it's going to be less expensive, but it's inferior to this US made steel, and usually it's been steel. So there is a trend there past just the lumping in, and so it is something to consider. Do your homework on it, and if you find out anything, leave a comment and let us know, because that's a very valid consideration.
I do want to qualify this just a little bit in that there is a lot of information out there that says that once you get a good seasoning layer on cast iron, that nothing gets through that anyways. That is absolutely not true. So I would, if you're concerned about that, don't be misled by this idea that you get this good seasoning on there and you can't get anything through. It's not true. So anyways, there you have it.
Cool. Well, that's been a great session. We got a lot more, but we'll have to tackle them another day. It's been great hanging with you guys, and we will see you soon.
Goodbye.
Bye.